In this lesson, we'll take a look at some of the ways that we can configure how the Visual Basic Editor works. So on my Developer tab, I'm going to click my Visual Basic icon to launch us into the VBE. And up here on the top menu, there is a Tools dropdown that offers an Options setting. So let's click into that. And that's going to bring up a new dialog box, a pop-up box called Options. We can see here it has 4 tabs: Editor, Editor Format, General, and Docking. And in this lesson, we're going to go through all of these settings that are available here. Some of these may be a little bit advanced. You may not know everything that's going on, but I do want to offer this introduction at the very beginning just so that we have a general sense of some of the things that we can configure. Of course, you can always come back to this lesson later in the course to get a good review of some of the options available here. And what I'm also going to offer you is a bunch of recommended settings, especially for beginners, that should ensure that you have as smooth a process as possible whenever you're actually going to be writing VBA code. Let's begin here on the Editor tab in this Code Settings panel. We have our first option here, Auto Syntax Check. If enabled, this means that VBE will display a dialog box or a pop-up box whenever it runs into a syntax error in your code. Now, you may think of this as a good thing, but it actually tends to get pretty annoying. Sometimes this thing creates a lot of false positives. So you may be writing a certain line of code and you may intentionally do something like a line break, which VBE might interpret as a mistake. And as soon as you do that, it's going to launch this pop-up box that takes you completely out of your flow. It prevents you from typing. It prevents you from doing any kind of action until you confirm that you're aware that there is an error. So it actually is pretty annoying and pretty restricting. So most developers prefer to have this option off. Now, the good news is, even if this option is off, VBE will still show you syntax errors in your code. It's just going to highlight them in a different color in the actual code itself. It's just not going to show you the annoying pop-up box. So I recommend disabling this option for now. The next option below is Require Variable Declaration. If this is enabled, VBA will insert a bunch of keywords at the top of each new module of code that you create, and those keywords will be option explicit. What that means is that all variables have to be declared within the scope of the module. Now, we don't know exactly what variables are at this point, but they are essentially placeholders or names that we're going to use for pieces of data. So whenever we're going to be referring to, let's say, a specific worksheet and a specific range, we might be assigning that data object a given name so that it's very easy for us to refer to it later on in the code, and that name is called a variable. And what this option does is ensures that all variables have to be declared, which means we have to tell VBA whenever we're going to use a variable exactly what kind of data type it's going to be, the fact that it's going to exist throughout the program, things like that. This is one of those things that will make you a better developer and that will ensure that the code is less likely to run into errors. I know it's a lot to take in right now, but I recommend keeping this option checked as a beginner. It means it's going to be a little bit more strict when it comes to evaluating your code. You're going to not be able to get away with certain things, but that's a good thing because when we're starting out, we want to be more strict. We want to be more likely to actually encounter errors so that we can go ahead and fix those early inefficiencies and become better developers over time. The 3 options below, Auto List Members, Auto Quick Info, and Auto Data Tips, are all pretty standard helpers. I recommend keeping them checked throughout your entire VBA programming career. Auto List Members will display a list of options to help complete whatever it is that you're typing. That's the feature that we call IntelliSense, where when we're writing out, for example, a worksheet object, we're going to see a list of all of the properties and methods that are available there. We can tab into them. There's really no reason to disable this. It's just helpful for you to know everything that's available for you whenever you're doing some kind of object reference. Similarly, whenever you enable Auto Quick Info, VBA will show you information about functions and their arguments as you type. This is another helpful feature, much like on the actual main Excel interface. When you sometimes type something like sum, it's going to show you here are the arguments, here are the inputs that you can give to the function, perhaps a description of what the function is actually going to give back to you or return to you. There's no real reason to disable it. It's really helpful for us to have a reminder of what we're actually doing whenever we code. So I recommend checking this as well. And finally, Auto Data Tips. This means that whenever we declare variables in our code, which again are just placeholders for pieces of data, whenever we hover our mouse over those variables, we can actually get the value that's being stored in the variable. So again, a little helpful thing for us as developers to get a quick reminder of some of the data and how it's being stored. Again, keep all these options enabled. There's really no reason to experiment here. If you want to make the process a little bit harder for yourself because you want to, let's say, remember things from memory and make sure that you're remembering them correctly, you can disable these options, but there's really no reason to. If you can help the computer help you become a better developer and help you complete code more efficiently, I think that's a good thing no matter where you are in your stage as a developer. To the right here, we have this auto indent option. I recommend keeping that checked as well. If this is enabled, VBE will indent every line of code the same as the previous line. So many times when we're going to be writing procedures, we're going to indent the entire body of the procedure in equal amount. This is not technically required, but it's a good visual indicator that all of the code is clumped together, that it represents a group, that what it accomplishes is kind of related to each other. So it's a good visual thing to do, and VBE will automatically do it for you whenever you have this option enabled. The tab width, predictably, is how many spaces a tab is going to represent, which is just setting the standard for how much something will be indented, for example, within a procedure. So all lines within a procedure will be equal to 1 tab length, which is equivalent to 4 spaces. That's what we're setting here. Down here below, we have the Windows settings options. This first one, drag and drop text editing, allows you to actually drag and drop text with your mouse. I don't tend to use this feature. I just use, copy and paste, but there's really no reason to disable it. It's an extra functionality if you need it. Finally, here we have default to full module view and procedure separator. This first one, default to full module view, will make sure that your procedures appear as a single scrollable list whenever you open up a module. If you keep this option disabled, you'll have to kind of navigate through each procedure one by one. I prefer to have everything kind of written out, sort of like one Word document where you scroll down and you see the next bit of text. In this case, you'll scroll down and you see the next procedure. I think that's a better way to organize your code. It resembles more of what real-life code bases look like. So I think this is a good option to keep enabled as well. Everything in one big scrollable list of code. This final option, procedure separator, will create a horizontal line between any two procedures. It's a separator line. That's why it's called the procedure separator. And this is, again, just a visual indicator that two procedures are separate. You can, of course, read them and figure that out yourself, but it's much nicer when we have this helper feature that's kind of giving us a visual hint of what's going on. It'll make you much quicker in detecting where one procedure starts and where it ends and where the next one starts. So again, keep this option enabled. Really no reason to disable it as well. Our next pane here in the options box is editor format. This relates to how your editor looks, so the aesthetics of your code. So I'm not going to dive too much into this because this is a matter of personal preference. In fact, I recommend if you're going to proceed throughout the course, I recommend sticking with the basic defaults. That way your code will look more similar to mine than if you start customizing it. Again, the most important part when it comes to programming is syntax, which means writing the right code, not exactly how it looks. But if you want to have, let's say, a custom font or a custom font size, you can even set different parts of code. So the actual code itself, how an error code will look. For example, this is syntax error text, and we're going to have it in red. You can customize all these options. It's totally up to you. Depends on whether you want to express yourself when you write code. But I'm not going to mandate anything. I'm just going to stick with the default settings. The only difference with me is I'm going to blow up my size a little bit here. I'm going to use 23 or 24. This is just to ensure that the videos are able to capture the font and it looks a little bit bigger and is easier for you to see, but you don't have to keep your code so big. You can keep your code at a standard default size font, maybe 12 or 14, whatever is comfortable for your eyesight. The one thing I do recommend is if you're going to be switching your font around from the default of Courier New, I recommend doing a monospace font. A monospace font is one in which every single character or every single letter has an equal width. So no matter whether you type an A or an R or a Z, they all have an equal width. And that is a good thing in programming because it means that your code is much more likely to line up. Whenever you look at multiple lines of code above or below each other, the letters in them will line up, which is a good thing when it comes to code. It's not always a good thing when you want to be stylish and have kind of a pretty presentation, but in this case it is. So whenever you're picking a new font, I recommend Googling, is this font monospace, and making sure that it is. Some fonts are not, and it's gonna break up your code a little bit and make it a bit more difficult to read. So make sure your font is monospace if you're doing something different. Otherwise, just stick with Courier New and you're not gonna have any problems with this standard option. Also, this margin indicator bar option should be checked. This will just create a margin bar to the left of your code. We're going to be using that for things like debugging our code, breaking it at certain points of execution. Keep this checked. There's really no reason to disable it. Let's move on now to the General tab, the third tab in our options pane. You can keep most of these options standard or default. This form grid settings pane to the left deals with user forms, which again are those custom forms that we can create to gather user information that include things like buttons and checkboxes and input fields so that we can process data but give the user a much more compelling form instead of having them fill out the spreadsheet. So we can keep all this stuff here, keep all this stuff here as well. That just relates to tooltips that help you figure out various things in the interface. The only important thing here that we should change is, if it's not already changed, is under error trapping, make sure you have the break on unhandled errors option selected. This means, just as the name says, that whenever you run into an error that is unhandled, which means you haven't prepared for it, you haven't warned VBA to expect it, if you run into an error, it will automatically break execution at that point, which is a good thing because we want to write code that is stable and secure. So we do want it to break on errors so that we can detect those mistakes and bugs, fix them, and then ensure that we don't run into them again. Otherwise, there may be options here like break on all errors, which means it's going to break on errors, even including those that we've accounted for, which is really not helpful. We only want to break on that which we haven't prepared for so we can have a heads up, we can be alerted to them and fix that stuff. Let's move on now to the final pane here, which is docking. On this pane, we can keep all of the standard settings as well. Whenever a window is dockable, it means that it's attachable to some part of the VBE window. So for example, we have our immediate window, which is available right here below. We have the properties window, which is this thing on the bottom left. And we have the Project Explorer, which is this thing on the top left. We can essentially click and drag these to various parts of the screen, and they're going to attach themselves automatically and contort their shape to fit themselves, maybe as an entire vertical column or as an entire horizontal column. In this case, you can see that both the Project Explorer and the Properties window are kind of nestled underneath each other, and they both occupy half of the vertical pane. It's just going to make your code a lot easier, rather your sections of code, your sections of the VBE editor, easier to kind of behave like puzzle pieces and add them onto each other in different sections of the screen. So you can keep all these default settings. The only one that is disabled is the object browser, which we'll dive into later. The object browser is a documentation feature that allows you to look up things like objects and methods and the general structure of the Excel object model. This thing is typically going to open up right where this gray space is, and it's going to occupy the entire screen the exact same way as our code editor does. So because it occupies this entire screen, we don't really need it to be dockable. We don't really need it to be able to be transported to any part of the screen and kind of latch on. So for the most part, these standard options are pretty good. We can keep them, and that's really all there is to cover here on the docking tab. And that's all of the basic options available for us in the Visual Basic Editor. Again, feel free to come back to this lesson to review some of these concepts. Feel free to Google some of these concepts in more detail if you're interested in how you can configure a Visual Basic Editor to work more on how you like to code. Again, maybe perhaps you want different aesthetics, maybe you want different help features. For the most part, the way that we've enabled this stuff is to ensure that you have as easy a time coding as possible and that we don't disrupt you in the middle of coding. We just offer you helpful hints. So this is a good place to get started for a beginning VBA developer, and most of these options you'll find that you're going to stick with even as you grow your proficiency. That's all there is to cover here. I'll see you in the next lesson. In this lesson, we'll take a look at the basic syntax for creating a new procedure in our Visual Basic Editor. As we know, a procedure is just a collection of one or more VBA statements that accomplishes some kind of task or goal. A procedure from top to bottom does something for us. A procedure is also known as a subprocedure or a routine or a subroutine or a macro or a program. There's many different terms that we can use, but for the most part, it's just some kind of thing that we're doing, a collection of related code, a snippet or grouped collection of code. A procedure is going to be executed from top to bottom, line by line, so we write our VBA code in the exact same order that we want the program to execute it. Procedures are going to be organized within files that we call VBA modules. We can go ahead and create one here right now in this brand new workbook in my Visual Basic Editor. On the left side here, I'm going to right-click on Microsoft Excel Objects, hover over Insert, and choose Module. and a new module will be inserted here, right here to the left. It's going to be called Module 1, and all modules will follow this numeric naming scheme. So if we were to add another module, it would be Module 2, Module 3, and so on. The number is just going to increment by 1 each time. And over here to the right in our code editor, we have this module and its code listed. Right now we have no code. You'll notice here at the very top, we have option explicit written. That's because we enabled this option back in our settings in the previous lesson. This ensures that our variables have to be declared. We're going to dive into what that means a little bit shortly, but you can think of this as just a way to ensure that our code is less prone to errors. To change a module name, we have to head to the properties window on the bottom left here of the VBE. Right here we have this name property and it's set to module 1. We can change this to something different. Let's change this to something like my first module. And ideally, modules should store procedures that are related to each other. So whenever you have a workbook with multiple modules, you can store related functionalities, related procedures in each one of the modules. So maybe one of the modules is going to deal with aesthetics like fonts. Another one of the modules may deal with things like copy and paste operations. Another module may deal with creating tables and charts. It really depends on how you want to structure the workbook and how you want to structure your code. But ideally, each module should have procedures that are all related to each other. And if you want to insert a new module, you just once again go to Modules, Insert, create a brand new module, give it a name that describes what it contains, and just write all of your procedures within there. So let's go ahead and write a procedure within our code editor right here. Now we're not actually going to be doing anything within the procedure. I want to dive into the syntax for creating a procedure from scratch because it can be pretty complex. There are a couple things that we have to remember, so I want to make sure we set our foundations here correctly. So all procedures begin with a built-in keyword in VBA called sub. So we're going to write the sub keyword. Sub is short for subroutine, which is an old technical programming term for a procedure. So anytime you're going to be writing a procedure, it has to start with this sub keyword. A subroutine in computer science terms is just a sequence of program instructions. And that's exactly what we're doing here. We're writing a set of commands that VBA and Excel will execute for us. Immediately after the sub keyword, we write the name of the subroutine followed by a pair of parentheses. That means an opening parentheses and a closing parentheses. Let's say I want to call this procedure my first procedure. So I'm going to do my first procedure and follow it up with a pair of parentheses. Notice that here I have multiple words in my procedure name, so the way I distinguish between them is to capitalize the first letter of each. The reason I do that is because subroutine names cannot contain spaces, so there's no way that we can do something like this. VBA is going to give us an error, so we want to make sure there are no spaces. And how can we differentiate between different words? We use capital letters. We call this type of syntax upper camel case, so you can look up that in more detail if you're interested, but it essentially means the first letter of each word is going to be capitalized. A couple other bonus quirks about procedure names. It's recommended to keep your first letter capitalized. If you don't, VBA will automatically capitalize it for you. You also can't use reserved VBA keywords. So by a reserved keyword, I mean a word that's already part of the VBA language. So for example, a word like sub or option or explicit, you can't just write sub or sub option. Don't use any words that are part of VBA because it's going to run into an error. You'll also notice that when I clicked around here, VBA automatically did some stuff for us, so I'm just going to remove it. It's actually trying to help us write better code, but we're going to remove this right here so we can write it from scratch. So after we're done executing this, as soon as we press enter, you'll see that VBA is going to do what it just did. It's going to add this end sub keyword. And what that means is that's the end of the procedure. So anything within this, what we call the body, anything between the beginning of the procedure, which starts with the sub keyword, and the end of the procedure, which is the end sub keywords, everything in between is going to be the actual code that's going to be executed whenever the procedure runs. So let's just write this from scratch so that we can make sure that we type it correctly. It's going to be the end keyword, and it's going to have a capital E followed by the sub keyword, and the S in sub is also going to be capitalized. So again, whenever you type your parentheses, Visual Basic will automatically add this end sub for you, but in case it forgets or in case it makes a mistake, it's a good idea to practice this entire syntax from top to bottom to make sure that you know you kind of commit it to memory. Believe it or not, this is a valid procedure. Now, it doesn't actually do anything because we don't have any code in here, but it doesn't really have to do anything. We can still run this procedure, we can still run this code, and it's going to do nothing. You can sort of think of it like an empty text file. An empty text file doesn't have any content within it, but it's still a valid text file, right? It still has the right extension. It's sort of the same idea here. This is a valid procedure because we used the proper syntax. It's just a procedure that does nothing. So we can go ahead and try to execute this procedure. I can just hover my mouse in here, click into the body of the procedure, the white space between the sub and the end sub. And right here on the top menu bar, I can click the play button, the green play button. And you can see I'm clicking it, nothing is happening, but nothing should be happening because we haven't actually done anything. But we're also not running into any errors, which is the important thing, which means that VBA is telling us there's nothing syntactically wrong with your code. This is a valid setup for a procedure. So this is perfectly correct. That's almost all there is to cover in this lesson. I didn't want to burden you with too much because this is actually quite a lot of information to take in. The syntax can be a little bit confusing, especially when you have to remember things like camel case, spacing, the sub keyword, the end sub keyword, the parentheses, which we also don't know what that does yet, but we'll dive into that a little bit later. But this is the syntax that you'll be using for every procedure you're ever going to write in VBA code. So I do recommend writing a couple of these procedures from scratch, especially just removing your code, deleting it, and just typing it from memory, because you'll be surprised how many times it takes for you to actually memorize this stuff. Predictably, it may seem kind of obvious, but if you ever want to delete a procedure, all you have to do is just highlight all of the code that includes it and just press delete. Removing it from the text of the module removes it from the front end as well, so you won't be able to actually access this macro from the macros dialog box in the Excel interface. If you just want to bring it back, you can just bring it back. Just be very careful, because if you accidentally delete something like the sub part of it, but you forget the end sub, or vice versa, you're going to run into errors whenever you're trying to run another valid procedure. So just make sure you delete the entire procedure as a whole. If you want to delete an entire module of code, which you may want to do if it becomes outdated, for example, you can right-click on the name of the module here in the Project Explorer, select Remove. It's going to have the module name, Remove My First Module. It's going to offer to save some of the module code if you want to store it elsewhere. So it says, do you want to export My First Module before you remove it? We're rarely going to do this, so we can just click no, and then the module is permanently deleted from the workbook, and it's no longer storing any of our code. So instead of manually going through and deleting all of the procedures, you can just delete the entire module that's holding those procedures. That's all there is to cover here. Make sure to practice that procedure syntax, and then we're actually going to go ahead and start writing some actual valid VBA code in the procedure body over the course of the next few lessons. A few lessons ago, we briefly discussed the immediate window, which is located at the bottom of our VBE. The immediate window is a really helpful tool whenever we want to test, for example, a single line of VBA code without actually packaging it within a procedure. The immediate window is sort of like a console. It's a playground. It's a place to make experiments with code, because the process of creating a brand new module and writing a procedure is kind of time consuming. There's a lot of clicks involved, and if we only want to test that one line of code works as expected, we really don't need to go through that hassle. We can just use the immediate window as a little bit of a playground to try out something. So it's not intended for large scale procedures. It's really intended for 1 or 2 lines of code at a time, just to make sure that everything is functioning as expected. If the immediate window is missing from your Visual Basic Editor interface, for example, if it looks something like this, there's 2 ways we can bring it up. The first is using the keyboard shortcut Control+G. That will bring up the immediate window. I'm also going to click out of it and show you the other way to access it. That's going to be under the View menu at the very top. View, here we have immediate window listed alongside its keyboard shortcut. That's going to bring up the immediate window at the very bottom. Again, all of these tools, all of these aspects of the Visual Basic Editor are dockable. We made that happen in our settings configuration lesson, so we can actually move this around and place it on the left or on the right. But this is the traditional setup where we're going to have the immediate window at the bottom, and then the properties window at the bottom left, and the Project Explorer at the top left. In the immediate window, we can write completely valid VBA code. So we can access properties in here, we can execute methods, we can ask VBA to perform basic mathematical calculations. Everything is valid here. Just remember to keep it concise, one line of code at a time. So for example, let's say we want to try a basic mathematical expression. In that case, whenever we're asking VBA to answer some kind of question for us, whenever it needs to evaluate some kind of expression, we need to begin with a question mark. You can think of a question mark just like asking a real-life question. If this is something that you might go over to your coworker and ask, then it requires a question mark in the immediate window. So for example, if I want to know the answer to 2 plus 2, because I'm asking a question, I do need to prefix that expression with the question mark. When I execute this, I'm going to get the correct answer, which is 4. So whenever we're getting something like a property value, we are getting something, which means we're asking a question as well. So in those situations, we also have to include the question mark. For example, let's say I put a value here in cell A1. I'm just going to put my name, Boris. Let's say I want to find out the value that's currently in cell A1 from the immediate window. I once again have to begin with a question mark. I'm asking a question. I'm not performing some kind of process or action or method. I'm just inquiring about the state of something. So I can put my syntax here of accessing a range. Here in a string, I put the range or the cell that I want to access, that's cell A1. We know that a range object has a value property. If we're not setting it, we're getting it. So now when I execute this, we can see it's giving back to us the value that's written on the spreadsheet, which is Boris. If we're going to set the value of a property of an object or invoke a method, anytime that we're doing something that represents an action that we take, in that case, we do not need to use the question mark because we're not asking a question. We're telling VBA to do something. So setting a value on a property does not require the question mark. So if I wanted to set range A1 to have a different value, I can do range A1 dot value. Again, completely valid VBA code. This would work just fine in a procedure, but if we want to do something very simple like this, we can just use the immediate window. Let's say I want to set it equal to hello. Write this, execute this. We can see on the left side that hello has now occupied cell A1, and you can see we've used the immediate window to execute a valid line of VBA code. The important part here, if this isn't obvious, is that all of this is temporary. The immediate window is not preserved when we close the workbook. So this is just to execute a one-line piece of code. If we want to preserve an operation so that we can run it again and again, we do need to write it within a procedure. I also want to point out that there is an alternative way that you can use the question mark here in the immediate window. I'm just going to erase my work right here. Instead of using the question mark, you can use a keyword called print. And print is the exact same thing as a question mark. So if I did something like print 2 plus 3, we're going to get the exact same result. Most people prefer to use the question mark because it's a little bit lighter and shorter. It's only one character, but print does the exact same thing. We can also print to the immediate window from an actual procedure body. This is really helpful when we want to keep track of something as it's going on in our procedure. As we're executing, we may want to find out what the current value is that's being stored, let's say in a variable, which we'll talk about in a few lessons. Sometimes we want to keep track of data that is changing throughout the process of our procedure execution. So we can actually log things to the immediate window from a procedure body. Let's go ahead and create a brand new module to store our procedure. So insert a new module. The default module name of module 1 is fine for now. And I'm going to create a procedure here, again with a sub keyword, print stuff to console. Once again, we have to add on that pair of parentheses at the end. The Visual Basic Editor will automatically add end sub for us, but you do have to remember those keywords in case it doesn't. And right here, in order to actually print something to the immediate window, we have to do this, debug.print. Debug is actually an object that's available within VBA, and print is a method on that object. Just like we have valid objects like worksheet and workbook, we have a debug object. It has two methods on it. The one that we want to focus on right now is print. And in order to actually print something, we just write it to the right of that method invocation. So for example, if I want to find out what 1 plus 1 is, I'm just going to remove this code right now. Now this is our first experience actually executing a procedure with custom code within it. When I execute this, there's nothing that's going to happen on the Excel interface, but we are going to take the evaluation of this expression, which is going to be 2, and with debug.print, we're going to print it to the immediate window. So let's execute this right here by clicking the green play or run button, and there we can see 2 is output. This is really helpful when you want to, for example, do something on the spreadsheet and then also keep track of something as a developer here in the Visual Basic Editor. We can sort of keep track of those variables in the immediate window to see how they evolve over the course of a procedure. For example, what we can do here is change the value within our range of A1. So for example, what I can do is output the current value of range A1. So I'm just going to do range A1.value. So I'm going to get the value at the very start of the procedure and output it to the immediate window. Below that, I'm going to actually change the value. Let's change it now to goodbye, another string. And after that, let's go ahead and debug print the value in range A1 again, so we can sort of confirm that it's changed from our code. In fact, let me buy a little bit of real estate here so you can actually see this code a little bit clearer. There we go. I'm also going to remove all the code from the immediate window so we don't get confused. So once again, let's just go through this line by line. We've created a new procedure with a sub keyword. It's called print stuff to console. It actually does a little bit more than that, but that's fine. We begin by getting the current value in range A1. This is just getting the value property of that object. Pretty familiar syntax, but we cannot use the question mark within a procedure. We can only use that in our immediate window. So in order to actually log this to the immediate window, we use debug.print. After that, we're going to write a value to cell A1, a brand new value of goodbye. Once that's written, we're going to once again use debug print to log something out to the immediate window, and it's going to be the new value that's stored in range A1. So let's see what happens. We begin here with hello. When we click run here, perfect. We have goodbye right here on the left side. That's actually the second step of our procedure. But right here, hello is printing. That's this line right here. Then we're changing the content on our spreadsheet. And finally, this goodbye that we see at the bottom is this debug print invocation right here. That's all there is to cover in this lesson. We talked about the question mark. We talked about the immediate window, which is a playground of sorts where we can execute one-liners of code. And we also talked about debug print within a procedure body, which allows us to log stuff out to that immediate window, to that console within a procedure. In this lesson, we'll take a look at the message box method, which is used to display a pop-up box with a message in the Excel interface. This is really helpful for a couple of reasons. The first one is that we can use it very similarly to debug.print to see the value of something like a variable over the course of our procedure execution. The other cool thing is that we can actually use it to alert the user of some kind of message. Debug print is only available to us in the immediate window as a VBA developer in our actual editor. But with the message box, we can give the user a message that they can see in the Excel interface itself. Let's begin this lesson by practicing message box a couple of times in our immediate window, and then we'll write the exact same code within an actual procedure body. So right here in the immediate window, I'm going to type the word message box. It's a little bit abbreviated. It's actually going to be capital M, S, G, capital B, O, X, message box. And as soon as I click space here, we're going to see a little box pop up, a yellow box that's going to offer us a little bit of help in completing the method definition. So let's go into this in a bit more detail. Here we see the yellow box. This is our first introduction to the concept of parameters and arguments to methods. So methods, much like Excel functions in our Excel program, can take inputs. An input helps modify how the function or method is going to perform. For example, in Excel, we have a basic function like sum, but sum by itself can't do anything. It needs to know the values that it's actually going to add together. Well, this is very similar here in VBA. Visual Basic includes this thing called the message box, which is used to output text in a box to the user. But it has no clue what we actually want to output, the actual content of the text itself. We have to tell that method what to do in that sense. The way we do it is by giving the method inputs. Now those inputs, we use the terms parameter and argument interchangeably most of the time, but there is a difference between them. Right here, we see in this yellow box the name of all of the parameters that the message box method expects. Some of them are optional and some of them are mandatory. They're listed here in the order they have to be given to the method. So you can see here the very first parameter, or the very first name that we've given to an expected input, is prompt. And prompt represents the actual text or expression that we want to evaluate and output with the message box. So when I type something in here, let's say I'm just going to output the message hello. Notice that it's a string, so I have to wrap it in double quotes. Hello, or the input that we want to provide to the prompt parameter, is what we call the argument. So the parameter is the name of the input, And the argument is the actual value that we give whenever we invoke the method. So prompt, again, is the parameter, and hello in this case is the argument that we provide for the prompt parameter. And another word for any of these two words, again, is input. Hello is an input that we're giving to the built-in message box method so that it knows what to output. In this case, the other things that we see right here are all optional. They don't need to be included. So when we execute this code, this should work just fine. When I press enter right here, we're going to see this box pop up. I have it appear a little bit in the middle because I'm splitting my view between Excel and the Visual Basic Editor. But if the regular user has just Excel open, this box will appear right in the center of their Excel interface. We can see hello is listed here, the exact same message we typed out here, minus, of course, the double quotes. And we have this OK button. Once they click that, then it goes back to the same old, same old. Now keep in mind, if we use the message box within the body of a procedure, it's going to temporarily halt or pause the remainder of the procedure. So the procedure is kind of going to wait until the user confirms with the OK button, and then it's going to continue executing the remaining code that's still left in the procedure. So the message box does pause, so which kind of acts as a little bit of a deterrent to continue processing things. So it's not something that you want to use over and over and over again. But if you want the user to do something like click OK to make sure they're aware that something is going on, it can be a pretty particular tool that you can use to sort of give the user some awareness about what's going on. Let's go ahead and use message box a couple more times. So I'm going to remove all my code right here. Let's take a look as well at the yellow helper box that's appearing when we start typing. So message box, and there we go, it pops up again. So we can see here the names of all of our parameters. They're separated by a comma, and the one that's currently being entered, the one that's active, the one that we're providing a value for, is going to be highlighted in a slightly more bold, blacker font. So we can see here prompt is highlighted, which means that's the input or parameter that VBA is expecting us to provide an argument for now. So if we do something like goodbye this time, and we put a comma, just like we see here in the yellow pop-up box, the bold highlighted section will change because now VBA is expecting an input or argument to that second parameter, to that second input. Let me just erase this comma because we don't need it. Now we go back to prompt. So reading here from left to right, we can see our parameters are prompt, buttons, then we move on to title, help file, context, and then finally that as is not actually a parameter, it's just describing what is going to be the return value of this method, which we don't have to worry about for now. A couple things that I want to point out here. Notice that buttons, title, help file, and context are surrounded in square brackets. Those square brackets are a visual indicator that that parameter or argument is optional. It's not needed. You can provide it to help modify how the method is going to work, but it's not required for the method to function. In comparison, prompt does not include a pair of square brackets, which means it's mandatory. You have to put it in there or it's not going to work. Of course, and that makes sense because how can you output some kind of text in a message box if you don't tell message box what that text is going to be? So prompt is the only required argument here. Let's go ahead and give this a shot. Once again, I'm going to press enter, execute this. There is our message box. It pops up. Notice it says Microsoft Excel at the top. That's just the standard title. Here is our message goodbye. And here we have the OK button. Click OK, back to normal. I want to take a little bit of time here to introduce you to a special symbol that we can use when working with strings, and it's called the concatenation symbol, and it's actually the ampersand sign, which you can access by pressing Shift-7 on your keyboard. So what the ampersand symbol does is it concatenates or combines two strings together. So for example, if I want to output a string that's going to be, let's say, my first name and my last name, I can do my first name, and then I'm going to do a space just to make sure that there's a space after my name. Then I'm going to put an ampersand, that's this symbol, again, Shift-7. And right here in another string, I'm going to do my last name. So what this is going to do is it's going to combine this string on the left before the ampersand symbol with the string on the right, my first name, a space, combined with my last name, put them all together as a common string, evaluate that expression, and that's what we're going to see in our message box. So when I execute this, there we go, the full name appears. Let's go ahead and click out of this box. Now you may be wondering, of course, what's the purpose of this? I could have just entered this as a single string, and you're absolutely correct. But sometimes we need to combine something like a user input with our own custom string. And with the user input, we're not going to know exactly what that's going to be. So we may need to use a symbol like this in order to combine things like that. Whenever one string is unexpected and the other one is actually predetermined, a symbol like the concatenation operator will come in handy. Let's go ahead and use message box now in the actual body of a VBA procedure. I'm going to remove this code in our immediate window. Once again, we have to create a module to store our procedure. Right-click on Microsoft Excel Objects, insert a module. We can leave the default name of module 1 for now. And let's just create a method here. I'm just going to say show boxes, give it a name of that. Parentheses, VBA is going to fill in the N sub at the end. And let's tab in a little bit here just so we have our body indented. That's a good practice, just so we have a visual indicator that this is the heart or content of our procedure. And let's do message box a couple times in order actually, so we can see all of these boxes appear in sequence. So once again, message box. When we press space, we're once again going to see that yellow prompt. By the way, should have mentioned this earlier, but the yellow box here is popping up because of an option that we enabled in our Excel options a little bit earlier, a couple lessons ago. If you followed all of the configuration instructions there, you should be seeing this. If not, you should go back to that video. It's in the very first pane within our Excel options box that we enabled this feature, which can be really helpful to us as a developer because we have a good reminder of what parameters the method is expecting. So let's do a couple things here. Let's output a message box with a string of hello there. So far we've been sticking with strings, but we can do basically any kind of data type. So let's output a number here. Let's just output the number 2. Right below, let's once again do message box, MSGBOX. This time, let's do a calculation of numbers. So let's do 3 plus 5. This is very similar to what we just did in the immediate window with the concatenation operator. VBA will first evaluate the expression. In the previous example, it's going to evaluate the concatenation of strings. In this case, it's going to evaluate the numeric arithmetic calculation. Once it's done with that, that's what it's actually going to output. So the message box here will have the value 8. And finally, let's go ahead and put a value here in range A1 just to show you that we can use the message box to output a range value. Let's say I'm going to put a string in here. Let's just call it fun. And right here in my Visual Basic Editor, message box. And how do we reference range A1? We use the range keyword, open up our parentheses, reference the actual cell or range that we want to access, and then access the property value on the range object. And that's going to access the value fun and output it in a message box. So let's go ahead and click in here. We're going to execute this procedure. We're going to see 4 total message boxes appear. Number 1, hello there. Number 2, perfect naming. Let's click OK here. Message box 8, that's the sum of 3 and 5. And finally, a message box with the value fun, which is exactly what we see in cell A1. I want to conclude this lesson by tying a lot of these concepts together. I mentioned at the beginning that message box is a method, but a method on what? We know that methods exist on actual objects, but we don't have any actual object listed here. As it turns out, message box is actually a method on an object called VBA. It's a little bit confusing, I know, because VBA is also the name of the programming language that we're actually learning here. But within the context of our Visual Basic Editor, we have an object also called VBA. Just like we saw an object called debug a lesson or two ago, just like we have an object called worksheet and workbook, we have an actual object called VBA. And the message box method is a method that is attached to that VBA object. So what I can go ahead and do here is just write VBA dot message box. And I'm going to do that for all of these just so you see that it's going to do the exact same thing when we execute. So as you might guess, the reason we don't explicitly need to write VBA in front of message box is because Excel and VBA is smart enough to figure out that that's what you mean. It knows what message box is. The exact same way that it assumes when you're using range that you're referring to the active workbook and the active spreadsheet. The exact same way here, if you use message box, Excel assumes that, well, hey, I have this VBA object in the background. I know that it has a method called message box. That must be what you're using. But if you want to use explicit references like this, you're more than welcome to if that helps you get a little bit more clarity. This message box method, again, is just a regular method on a built-in object called VBA. So when I execute or run this procedure right here, again with that green play button, here's my first one, second one, third one, and my range A1 value of fun. The VBA object stores a lot of what we call utility functions. A utility function is one that helps the programmer be more efficient. So in addition to things like message box, the VBA object includes functions that help with time and date, mathematical operations like absolute value, even text functions like extracting characters from the left side of a string or the right side of a string. These methods are all bundled together within the VBA object, and it's mostly used by us developers to kind of help us write our code a little bit more efficiently, to have utility or speed or efficiency when it comes to writing our code. We're going to dive into the VBA object in greater detail a little bit later in the course, but that's all there is to cover in this lesson. We talked about message box, which is a method on the VBA object. It outputs some kind of value to a box that the user can see in their interface. The input that we give it, we call that an argument. An argument is given to the concept of a parameter, which is just a name for an expected input. In this case, our message box method has a parameter called prompt, and we're giving that prompt parameter various arguments. Here we're giving it, for example, the arguments hello there, 2, 3 plus 5, etc. It evaluates that input in order to customize how the message box is going to perform, and then just outputs that value for us to see, or for the user who's running the procedure to confirm. That's all there is to cover here, and I'll see you in the next lesson. In this lesson, we'll take a look at comments in VBA. A comment is simply a line of text that is ignored whenever a procedure is run. And comments serve a variety of purposes. As developers, we can use them to offer up descriptions or explanations of what's going on in our code, either for ourselves if we come back to the code at a later date, or for other developers. We can use comments to describe the logical flow of a program, explain certain variable names or certain features that we're using. We can also simply leave metadata like the name of the procedure, who wrote it, the last time and date that it was modified. A particularly effective use of comments is actually using them to temporarily block certain pieces of code from executing. Sometimes we will have a procedure where one line of code will result in an error, and what we can do is temporarily disable it because a comment will make it just a regular ignored line of text, and that way we can sort of debug and figure out where a program is going wrong. Let's go ahead and show you how we can actually create some comments. So in a brand new workbook, in a new module, I'm going to create a procedure here, and I'm just going to call it comment example. The name is arbitrary. Let's add on those parentheses, and VBA will insert the end sub for us. And the way we create a comment is with a simple apostrophe symbol followed by the text that's going to be ignored. So the apostrophe symbol on most keyboards is found to the left of the enter key. It's this little symbol right here. And anything that follows afterwards is part of the comment, and it's completely ignored by VBA. So this is a random comment. When I press enter, it's actually going to be highlighted in green. That's the default color scheme for a comment. You may have altered this in the lesson a couple lessons ago when we talked about configuring our options, but essentially this means it's completely ignored. Regular valid code is going to be written in black, while comments are going to be displayed in green. So if we write a valid piece of code like message box 1 plus 1, and we execute or run this procedure by pressing the green button up here, you can see that we're going to get 2, that's as expected, but this didn't create any kind of error. So VBA properly knew to ignore this line completely. The other cool thing about comments is that they can actually be written after a piece of code, so they don't have to exist on their own on a separate line. For example, I can actually add a comment to the end of this line and say a description like adds 2 numbers. Anything after the apostrophe is not going to be executed, but anything before it is totally valid. So in this case, message box 1 plus 1 is still going to run, but this comment is not going to be processed at all. So when I execute this, we're once again going to get 2. Everything is still functional and valid. As I mentioned earlier, a really cool way that we can use comments is to temporarily disable certain pieces of code to see how the procedure would function without them. So let's say we had a piece of code like message box 3 plus 3. Let's just pretend that this is a part of our procedure where the code breaks. What we can do is just put a comment before it, and that will temporarily disable it and ensure that it doesn't actually run. And this can be particularly helpful because let's say we want to disable this. How can we do this otherwise? Well, that means we have to copy and paste the code somewhere else, then bring it back, and so on. And that can be pretty annoying and also potentially lead to some kind of code loss. We may accidentally lose track of where our code is being stored. So a comment is a really good way to temporarily disable some kind of line so that it doesn't run. Let me go ahead and uncomment this code. And down below here, I'm going to write a couple other valid lines of VBA code just to show you how we can optimize the process of creating comments. So let's say I just have a debug print here. Let's just print hello. And let's do another message box of goodbye. Doesn't really matter. These are all just random VBA statements. So if we wanted to make all 3 of these lines comment lines, we could place our cursor in front of each one and just write a apostrophe. But an easier way is to use a comment block, which is just a helper feature in VBA. Up here on the View menu, if we look down here, we have a Toolbars option, and we have this Edit toolbar available. This is not enabled by default, but it's going to pop up. For me, it pops up right here in the top right, but it may appear for you kind of anywhere in the middle. If you want to bring it up here, just click and drag it until it pops into place on any of the toolbars up above. And right here on the toolbar, on the edit toolbar, we have two buttons, comment block and uncomment block, and they work exactly as expected. So if I want to comment these three lines, I can just highlight all three of them, then click comment block, and VBA is automatically going to insert those apostrophes at the very beginning of the line. You can see that the code is now displayed in green, so it's random text. VBA will ignore it. And if we want to remove these comments, similar process, we just highlight the lines of code, click the uncomment block button, brings us back to our original state. That's all there is to cover here. Comments can be used really effectively. I do recommend writing plenty of comments as you proceed throughout the course. They can be really helpful for doing things like taking notes, explaining to yourself what a particular line is doing, explaining what a procedure is doing, why a certain decision was made. You can use them for any purpose whatsoever because VBA looks at it all equally, just text that it's going to ignore. That's all there is to learn here, and I'll see you in the next lesson.